Welcome to Football Conspiracies.
I'm Jared Cole.
And I'm Jared Rabinovich.
This week's episode, Super Bowl Hangover.
For this week's episode, we're going to be talking about something that I wouldn't really consider a conspiracy as much as I'd consider it a big part of NFL folklore. So I think you've probably heard of this. It's called the Super Bowl Hangover, or I've heard some people colloquially refer to it as the Super Bowl curse.
Yeah, this is not just a thing in football. I've seen it in a lot of other sports where the team that wins the championship has a lot of trouble the next season.
Yes, that's absolutely the general concept of the Super Bowl hangover. The idea that your team is hungover from the success of the last season and it's harder to perform in the current one. And you're right, this does happen in many major sports. Football is absolutely not the only professional sport where we see this theory come about. That being said, statistically speaking, did you know the NFL actually is hit by the championship hangover more than any other sport? At least the big four American ones.
No, I didn't know that, actually.
The odds of an NHL, NBA, or a MLB team winning 2 years in a row or having large success in the season following their championship is actually a significantly higher chance than for the NFL.
Huh, that's interesting.
It is, but as listeners to this podcast might know by now, the Super Bowl hangover and the reason we're talking about it is not all that it seems to be on the surface. So when people talk about the Super Bowl hangover or the Super Bowl curse, there's actually a few things that they're referring to when they say that. You got the one that is most commonly referred to, which is the non-repeat curse, when a team who wins the Super Bowl has trouble the next season, cannot win another one, or misses the playoffs entirely. The other one that happens in tandem with this one would be the Super Bowl runner-ups jinx, which is pretty much the exact same thing, but it happens with the runner-up in the Super Bowl. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And the last one would be the home field advantage curse.
Like, whichever team is considered the home team does worse? Is that what you're trying to get at?
No, it's actually not, and I'm kind of interested that you don't know this one as a Tampa Bay Buccaneers fan, but let's get into it in a minute.
But they won on home field.
Yes, and we'll get into that in 1 minute.
Okay.
The reason I find this topic so interesting is that this is a generally well-known piece of folklore within the NFL. Unlike many of the other topics that we cover, have spoken about, and will speak about, people actually know about this one.
Yeah.
However, in doing research for this episode, I began to notice a bit of an odd pattern relating to the demographic of NFL fans who spoke about the Super Bowl hangover with any sort of consistency. Do you have any idea who this demographic of NFL fan may be?
No clue.
You know, sometimes you would expect it to pertain to a certain team, fan base, something like that.
Yeah, like if your team continually does bad in a Super Bowl, Buffalo, then maybe it has to do with like a larger curse.
Gotta call me out like that.
Well, I mean, I can't think of another team that lost 4 Super Bowls in a row.
Well, there isn't another team that lost 4 Super Bowls in a row. The actual answer to this, though, might be a little interesting. It's actually older NFL fans.
Huh.
I have a couple theories as to why the Super Bowl curse theory or superstition might be more salient among older generations of NFL fans, and I think you might find these reasons pretty interesting. The first thing is that the aforementioned curses were actually more common to incur until recent years, specifically the home field advantage one that we will touch on a little bit later. But the reason that I think is more important for the topic of this podcast overall is today, for modern NFL fans, there are way more crazy curses and theories today for us to sink our teeth into.
Yeah, like, this is such a older theory that it's not becoming as interesting because there are so many newer theories.
Not just newer, but more exciting.
Yeah.
Right? These theories are a little bit milquetoast compared to the amazing stuff we see today. After all, isn't it far more interesting to believe that the colors of the Super Bowl logo predict the teams that will play in the big game than the previous Super Bowl winner won't be able to win again the next year?
Yeah, I guess fans might also not like that one so much because if their team wins the Super Bowl, then they think that they're not going to win the Super Bowl the next year.
Of course, and based on very recent evidence,
yeah,
it's completely untrue that the non-repeat curse is true at least 100% of the time.
Yeah.
At this point, I feel like I've teased the actual topic of the episode enough, so without further ado, I present to you the first of the Super Bowl curses we'll be speaking about today, the home field advantage curse. Before I began this episode, I actually wrote a cue for myself here to ask you, as a Bucs fan, someone who I believed would know a lot more about the home field advantage curse, about this, but I suppose your general knowledge on it isn't too deep.
Well, after you said home field advantage curse, I started to think about it, and I think I might know how this curse goes, but I want to hear you explain it.
Why don't you venture a guess for us?
Okay, fine. I think it's whoever has the home field has, like the advantage. Like, if you're the away team, you're cursed. Because I know Tampa hosted the Super Bowl and they won. And I know the Rams hosted a Super Bowl and they won. So I figure if you're visiting a team who's actually playing at home in the Super Bowl, you're going to lose.
Okay, that's actually a pretty good guess, but you're missing the first step here. And I understand why, as someone who is a Bucs fan and a recent NFL fan. You mentioned the Rams, but very simply, the curse states that the team that is set to host the upcoming Super Bowl is cursed with a bad season or playoff run. For example, next year the Super Bowl will be held in the New Orleans. So, according to this curse, the Saints are ready to have a bad season next year.
The Saints are always ready to have a bad season next year, whether or not they were hosting a Super Bowl.
That's absolutely true. But did you know that for the first 54 Super Bowls, no team had even played on their home field?
Yeah, I remember that they were saying that when Tampa got Tom Brady, it was going around like, oh, Tampa with Brady, and Tampa's hosting the Super Bowl, maybe they'll be the first team, and then they were, and it was amazing.
Absolutely, that is what happened. But up until that point, there was this idea that the team that was set to host the upcoming Super Bowl was somehow at a disadvantage, this so-called Super Bowl curse, or home field advantage curse.
Yeah.
And just for the listeners who are less versed on football, right now I just want to give a quick explanation on how Super Bowl stadiums and hosts are picked. Unlike many other sports where the team with the best regular season record is given home field advantage during the championship games, in the Super Bowl, the host is actually picked many years before the actual game is played. For example, we know it's going to be in New Orleans, like I mentioned, next year, even though we have no idea if the Saints will be in the Super Bowl, which they likely will not be. So, as you've alluded to so many times at this point, up until 2020, it's pretty understandable why a lot of people held this superstition. After all, a team had never played in a Super Bowl in their own stadium, let alone won a Super Bowl on their home field. However, as you well know, in 2020, that all changed. Super Bowl 55 was played between the Kansas City Chiefs and the Tampa Bay Buccaneers at Raymond James Stadium, the home of the Buccaneers.
Oh, yeah.
Not only were they the first team to ever play a Super Bowl on their home field, they were also designated the home team.
Well, yeah, they had the better record that season.
Absolutely, but it just adds a little bit more to the fold of the story, whereas in other Super Bowls played at home fields, that wasn't the case. And to top all of this off, they actually won. The first team to play at their home field during a Super Bowl also won the Super Bowl. Great story, lovely, cheers for the Tampa Bay fans.
Yes, very much so. Give ourselves a round of applause.
Hold back that applause, Brady. All right.
Why? They won a Super Bowl. We can applaud that. That is undisputable fact.
Brady won a Super Bowl. Let's be clear here.
That defense was amazing that year.
Eagles' defense was also pretty good this year, and somehow the Bucs beat them too, so we don't need to get into this one.
Because the Eagles sucked. At the end of the season, they were so bad. Oh my god.
I'll give you that one. I'm not going out to bat for the Eagles.
They were on like an 8-game losing streak to finish off the season.
You're absolutely right.
One win in their last 7. It was
honestly
ridiculous.
There was a small part of me that just wanted to see the tush push succeed.
The Bucs were the first team to naturally stop the tush push too.
In the most important moment of the season.
Yes. There was definitely no penalty on that play.
Definitely not. We digress. The Buccaneers became the first team to ever win on their home field or even play on their home field in a Super Bowl. In the face of all this, though, many proponents of the home field advantage curse began looking at Super Bowl 55 as the exception as opposed to the rule. I don't blame anyone for this position necessarily. After all, only one of 55 Super Bowls having a team play at their home field does seem a little fishy to me. On the face of it, at least. However, all this speculation should have been put to rest the next year when the Cincinnati Bengals and the Los Angeles Rams would find themselves facing off in SoFi Stadium, the home of the Rams. The Rams, the team playing on their home field, once again emerged victorious. This does mark the two only times that a team has played at their home field during a Super Bowl, but it is notable to say that it happened twice and they both won there. And in a sample size of only 58 Super Bowls, that happening 2 times is not a crazy statistic in my eyes. Well, in the past few Super Bowls, we've not seen a team play the big game at home. Many people have given up on their belief in this curse. It seems like the 2 consecutive wins on home fields kind of put a nail in the coffin of this curse.
For sure. I mean, I would say it was a pretty weak curse to begin with, only because it had never been seen before. And then you see it in back-to-back years, and it gets disproven twice. Like, it makes sense why this theory would have died pretty quickly after that Rams Super Bowl.
I completely agree. It seems like pretty weak tea to me. Before we move on from this theory, it is important to point out that the supposed curse becomes even more flimsy when you begin to take a look at the Super Bowl hosts over time. The fact of the matter is, Super Bowl hosting is not distributed evenly, and this, in regards to superstition, can mean one of 2 things. The first is that many teams are not susceptible to this curse because Super Bowls are never held in their home stadiums. The second thing is some teams have a far larger chance of winning at home as Super Bowls are played on their home field far more frequently than others.
Yeah, you mentioned you were talking about home field and we were talking about this curse, and I was thinking in my head about bringing this up, but you brought it up first. So over half the teams can't host a Super Bowl if you really think about it, because the Super Bowl happens at the beginning of February in the middle of winter. You can't host a Super Bowl in Buffalo or Minnesota or Detroit.
Absolutely read my mind. And these statistics only serve to back that up even more. 3 Super Bowls have been held at Raymond James Stadium, the home of the Bucs. Obviously, I don't want to take anything away from the Bucs. Wait, I take that back. I absolutely want to take something away from the Bucs. It does make it a little bit less impressive, especially considering all of these Super Bowls haven't played since 2007. Only 1 has been held at SoFi Stadium, the one where the Rams won, but it was a new arena that year, and there's already been a second Super Bowl planned for there in 2027. Florida, California, and New Orleans are far more likely than any other city to host the big game. They've actually had it combined 29 times in their cities.
That's a lot.
More than half of the Super Bowls have, or I guess exactly half of the Super Bowls have been played in one of these 3 cities. As an example, and this is not self-aggrandizing at all, there has never been and likely never will be a Super Bowl at Highmark Stadium, home of the Bills. This means they can't be negatively affected by the curse, but it also means that there is no circumstance under which they can be the team that manages to break the curse, like the Bucs managed to finally do.
Yeah, so, you know what? Maybe it's a curse, like I said at the beginning, where if you go to someone's field and it's their home arena, you're guaranteed to lose. And the Bills just will never get that perk like the Bucs did, or like LA will, or New Orleans if they can get their shit together.
Obviously, a sample size of 2 makes me a little bit reticent to accept that. That being said, it's happened 100% of the time, so there's nothing to disprove it at this point in time.
Yeah, I'm a full believer.
And I support you in that full belief, someone who will have another Super Bowl within the next 5 or 6 years, almost certainly. We have now reached part 2 of this episode, the non-repeat curse and the Super Bowl runner-up jinx. I've chosen to cover both of these aspects of the Super Bowl hangover theory in one part. The reason I've done this is because, while much of the evidence is different, the ultimate conclusion I came to on both of these topics is very similar, and there's no need for me to waste your time by bringing you to the same conclusion twice. However, I will go into the specific details for each of these curses and jinxes.
Okay.
The non-repeat curse states that the previous Super Bowl winners are likely to have a poor season the upcoming year. This doesn't just mean they won't manage to become repeat champions. In many cases, the defending champs have trouble putting up credible playoff performances, or, as in the case of many other instances, they don't even manage to make the playoffs at all. Similarly, the Super Bowl runner-ups jinx posits essentially the exact same theory, but in reference to the losers of the Super Bowl as opposed to the victor. For all intents and purposes, both theories state that the team who plays in the Super Bowl will perform poorly the upcoming season. And as you mentioned earlier, this is a superstition held in most sports.
Yeah, I mean, every year when the season starts, you're always talking about that championship hangover because, like, when the Colorado Avalanche won their cup and then the next season they started off super slow,
Awfully,
everyone
yeah.
was like, championship hangover, here it is.
Absolutely. Can you think of any reasons, particularly pertaining to the NFL, why a Super Bowl hangover might be realistic?
Well, especially in football, it's a really long season. So you have these players who are working they play 17 regular season games, plus they play all those extra playoff games, which definitely put wear and tear on a player's body, like guaranteed. But also, like, if you finish well, you don't get any good draft picks. You don't have a good future. And if you don't have a good future, then you can't make it back to the Super Bowl.
Those are absolutely the top two reasons I would cite. When you play a playoff run that's 4 extra games on a 17-game season, you're essentially playing 25% more football than all the other players who didn't make the playoffs. On top of that, you're right, you get the worst draft picks, you have the best team, and that's just the way it works, obviously. The only other reason I could really think of that you didn't mention was coaching changes. Top teams often have a lot more coaching changes than others because coordinators begin to get picked off as head coaching positions, often other franchises.
Yeah, I feel like in football more than other sports, like the list of amount of coaches that get taken to other teams and into higher roles, I feel like is way higher than a sport like baseball or basketball or hockey.
Absolutely. I have no statistics to back that specific claim up, but anecdotally, I completely agree with you.
For the 2013 Washington Redskins, I know it's not a crazy team, but like just to give people an idea of how the coaches change so often, the offensive coordinator was Kyle Shanahan.
Mm-hmm.
The quarterback coach was Matt LaFleur.
Yeah.
The wide receiver coach was Mike McDaniel. The tight end coach was Sean McVay.
That's wild.
That was just on offense too. And so you can understand these coaches are now like serious head coaches in the NFL.
Yeah, for listeners who didn't pick up on that, all of those people J. Cole just listed are very talented, top-level head coaches on other NFL franchises today.
Yeah.
Because all that we've spoken about, to any modern NFL fan that comes across this theory, it reeks immediately untrue. After all, modern fans have been around to see both the Patriots and the Chiefs dynasties manage to have several incredible back-to-back seasons, with both teams winning repeat championships at some point. As a matter of fact, at this very moment, the Kansas City Chiefs are back-to-back defending Super Bowl champs.
Yeah, tear streams down my face.
Let's just pray against the three-peat.
Ugh.
After all this, it should be clear that no one is claiming that the Super Bowl curse strikes 100% of the time with 100% of the teams. Rather, believers in this theory are claiming that the Super Bowl teams have poor performances the upcoming season at a rate which is statistically significant. Luckily for me, as I sat down to do this math, I discovered that someone had already done it for me. So thank you to Jason Pauly for his statistical analysis of Super Bowl Hangover, which we will post on our Twitter at FB Conspiracies. This study takes into account 50 Super Bowls, so it's not completely up to date, but it's still pretty reliable considering the already small sample size we are working with. For the record, there have now been 58 Super Bowls, so this is 50 of the 58 we're going to be looking at today.
You're just going to be discussing the first 50?
That's right, because this statistical analysis that I found ended there, and I looked at the rest of the seasons, and the numbers were very consistent in those last 8 seasons that are not included in the study. So I figured this is a pretty good summary of what it looks like today.
All right, let's hear some of these stats.
Absolutely. First, we're going to begin by talking about the runner-up jinx, so the curse relating to the losing team of the Super Bowl. The first important finding is that out of 50 Super Bowls analyzed, 15 out of the 50 losing teams did not manage to make the playoffs the following season. To make this finding even more damning, since 1998, 50% of all losing Super Bowl teams missed the playoffs. It was a coin toss.
Wow, that's crazy.
It is pretty wild. And if you want to make this even that bit crazier, to make the case of this curse even stronger, between Super Bowl 4 and Super Bowl 21, every runner-up made it to the playoffs the next season. This can be chalked up to the lack of a salary cap in the league, so players were more motivated to stay with their winning teams. After all, they offered the best chance of winning and the highest paychecks. But today, without those rules, after Super Bowl 21, the chance of being a Super Bowl losing team and making it to the playoffs the next year was about 50%.
Wow. So the salary cap era really fucked teams up.
Absolutely. Similar to many other sports we have seen.
Yeah.
Moving our way to the non-repeat curse now, the one that is relating to Super Bowl winners, I want to ask you, J. Cole, would you be surprised to find out Super Bowl winners are equally as likely to miss the following year's playoffs as Super Bowl losers are?
That would make sense to me because you have better coaches, so coaches are more likely to leave, and you're in a better position, so you get even worse picks.
All the disadvantages of being a Super Bowl competitor as the loser apply to the winner equally as much.
Exactly. Well, except for the fact that you lost a Super Bowl and the other team won a
Of
Super Bowl.
course, maybe that bit of motivation. But how much does that affect the next season is the big question. And as you rightly guessed, almost the exact same numbers apply to both winners and losers. With the winners category, only 16 out of the 50 Super Bowl winners missing the playoffs next year, as opposed to 15 of the losers.
Wow.
Since 1998, 44% of winning teams failed to reach the playoffs. This is almost the exact same number as cited for the runner-ups. For the runner-ups, it was 50%, and with the number of Super Bowls analyzed within that span, which is 18, that's only one difference in Super Bowls. From 1998, 9 Super Bowl winners out of 18 made it to the playoffs, and for the losers, it was 8.
Wow.
Yes. It may be more logically intuitive that losing teams are less likely to make it to the playoffs the next season, but as we have seen, there is no statistical significance in the difference between the two categories. But what are your reaction to these numbers on their face? It's pretty wild to me, at least on the face of it, that there's roughly a 30% chance that both Super Bowl teams manage to make the playoffs next year. Like, that doesn't seem high.
It makes sense to me, but it's also shocking. Because, those are supposed to be the best teams, and to see them have such terrible turnaround is just, it's crazy to think about if you're thinking surface level, but as you get deeper, it makes sense.
Absolutely, and if I phrase that statistic a little differently, it might come across differently, which I think is a fun exercise in statistics,
Yeah, give me the inverse.
If you are a team in the Super Bowl, there is a 71% chance you'll make it to the playoffs next year. That's pretty good if you ask me.
Yeah, that's really good.
Absolutely. And that is especially if we compare that to non-Super Bowl competitors. Do you have any idea what the number is going to be for non-Super Bowl competitors making it to the playoffs the next year?
No.
It's 47%. It's a huge difference. You are so much more likely to make the playoffs, 24% more likely to make the playoffs the next year if you were in the Super Bowl.
Wow. Well, I guess if you're a terrible team, then you're a terrible team, and it takes a lot to turn it around rather than a Super Bowl team going downhill.
Absolutely.
I guess.
I completely agree with that sentiment. But it's still pretty wild that this theory has been so long-lived when you look at the statistics, it's so obviously not the case.
Yeah.
I think from this number alone, it goes a long way in debunking the Super Bowl hangover theory.
I mean, only one team can win a Super Bowl every year. You have a 1 in 32 chance of winning the Super Bowl every year.
Exactly.
So, I mean...
And if you haven't been convinced by my case yet, I'm going to end off my segment with a few further problems I have with this theory. The first one is that making the playoffs is not necessarily indicative of how good a team is. Since 1978, and I'm quoting from the article now, there have been 23 teams with 10 or 12 wins that did not make the playoffs. 16% of 10-win teams do not make the playoffs, and 2% of 11-win teams do not make the playoffs. Mm-hmm. Additionally, 15 teams with either 7 or 8 wins have made the playoffs since 1978. An 8-win team has a 9% chance to make the playoffs, and a 7-win team has a 1.6 chance to make the playoffs.
These are good numbers, but then you think they expanded the playoffs, though, because there's more teams, so these past numbers aren't quite future results sort of thing.
That is absolutely the case, and for some of the seasons where there were strikes or lockouts and full seasons weren't played, this Those numbers were not included in this calculation, but you're right. Because of the change in format of playoff structure and how many teams and all these changes, this is not exactly correct numbers. But as we can see even today with your beloved Buccaneers...
Yeah, they did go 8-9 and still made the playoffs, but you will never see a team with 11 or even 10 wins nowadays miss the playoffs.
Almost certainly not, but it's still possible.
10-7 missing the playoffs is a little ridiculous.
10-7 is totally realistic to miss the playoffs, especially if in some divisions an 8-9 team can win the division.
Yeah, but that was amazing.
It was anomalous. It was not amazing.
Who was the 7-win team to make the playoffs?
I actually don't know. That would be an interesting question. I'm sure it was during the time when there was still only 16 games being played.
Yeah, it would have to be. Ooh, I'm going to hide it from you.
What's the big reveal?
All right, I have it right here. Who do you think it is?
I actually have no idea.
It was the Seahawks in the 2010-2011 playoffs.
I would have never guessed that. With a 7-9 record, that's horrifying.
Oh, and listen to this. It marked the 5th consecutive year a Super Bowl champion failed to win a playoff game in the next season.
Oh, wow. Love that.
Wow, that's crazy.
Wow, good tidbit for this episode. Very prescient.
Yeah, it's a good thing I asked.
Absolutely. The last problem I have with this theory that I need to bring up, and I mentioned it briefly before, and as a little bit of a statistics nerd, it's the number one thing I look at, which is the sample size is just way too low. I cannot comfortably come to any conclusions based on a study that has a sample size of 100 teams. And even if you extended this, 116 teams at most. Unfortunately, the NFL has not been around long enough for there to be a large enough sample size for this sort of study. Because of this, I do not feel comfortable coming to any sort of solid conclusion. That being said, I still think the evidence laid out today makes a very compelling case as to why the Super Bowl hangover is simply a myth. If believers in this theory need repeat Super Bowl winners every year to disprove it, in their eyes, the Super Bowl curse will always be alive and well.
Yeah, I mean, if the only way to disprove it is by doing one of the hardest things that you could do, then...
Exactly. Like, I wonder if this theory will die if the Chiefs win this
3
next
in a row?
year, or if they win 5 more until there's somehow a Super Bowl in Kansas City and they win a home field. You know, like, it just feels like if you're not going to accept what has already happened as evidence enough that this isn't real, there's not much that can happen short of impossibilities that will make you believe it.
So what sample size would you be comfortable to make a conclusion on?
A proper sample size?
No, but for this specific thing, what would a proper sample size be? If 100 doesn't work.
I would probably need... I think we're not going to come to a solid conclusion on this until we're at, like, Super Bowl 200, 250. Like,
so you think there has to be, like, 400, 500 teams?
More, 800, 1,000 to come to, like, any proper conclusion. And even still, that is, like, hardly true statistical significance. Within a sports league it is, because sports leagues haven't been around for long. But in the realm of statistics, hardly.
Yeah, it's too small of a number, I guess.
Exactly. That being said... Once again, anecdotally, from my opinion, this seems like a bit of a bust.
Yeah. I'm going with the bust for the repeat and winner curse. But for the home field advantage curse, I think it's actually flipped, where if you have the home field, you are guaranteed the win. Once
again, same issue with this I had before, sample size of 2.
Yeah,
that being said... I'm willing to accept the fact that you are 100% right now, and I have no evidence to dispute you.
Exactly. There's no evidence to dispute it so far, so I'ma believe it. There you go. That's the conspiracy I believe in today's episode.
You know what? I'll give you that one.
Alrighty, welcome listeners to my segment of the podcast where I delve deep into the bizarre and unexplained occurrences that make you question the reality that is the NFL. I've got some mind-bending stories and stats that will have you reaching for your tinfoil hat in no time. But actually today we're going to put back down our tinfoil hats because this story isn't so much conspiratorial as it is controversial.
Wow, it caught me off guard. You're sounding like me.
So I'm going to tell you guys one of my favorite football stories, and you're going to hear why it's such a great football story and why it's a little controversial.
I'm sold.
So we're going back all the way to Super Bowl I, okay? So the historic game that changed football forever, you know?
Oh yeah, that's definitely how I think about Super Bowl I.
Well, that's how I think about it after this. But, you know, Super Bowls are the perfect place for heroes to rise, the underdog to become the big dog, you know? So I'm going to tell you the story of Max McGee.
Who?
Max McGee, okay? So he isn't your typical star player. He's 34 years old in 1967 and a wide receiver for the Green Bay Packers, and he's at the tail end of his career.
Well, yeah, he's 34 in 1967. That's pretty much 80.
So in the entire season, he had 4 receptions for 91 yards and a touchdown in 10 games.
Okay.
And no one expected to see him at least on the field in the Super Bowl game against the Kansas City Chiefs. So the night before the big game, because Max McGee knew he wasn't going to play, he decided to break curfew and spend the night with some flight attendants that he met at the hotel bar.
Oh, Max McGee, you dog!
Max McGee had a night, okay? So let's just say Max McGee wasn't exactly feeling fresh the next morning. But fate had other plans. Early into the game, their starting wide receiver, Boyd Dowler, injured his shoulder. Suddenly, Coach Vince Lombardi, a man who demanded discipline, needed a replacement. And who did he call on? Our hungover hero, Max McGee.
Hell yes.
So what happened next is nothing short of legendary. Max McGee, fueled by either adrenaline or something else, played the absolute game of his life.
Can I vote on something else?
Yeah. So he snagged the very first touchdown in Super Bowl history, a one-handed catch, 37 yards from Bart Starr, the quarterback.
This is badass.
So the first touchdown in Super Bowl history was a one-handed catch by a hungover 34-year-old.
And he also almost halved the entire yards he got for the whole season in that one catch.
So it actually gets even better. He went on to catch 6 more passes for a total of 138 yards. Almost cracking, probably cracking what I would say a top 10 receiving performance in Super Bowl history. Even by today's standards, that's very impressive. To top it all off, he actually added another touchdown, so he scored 2 TDs on the day.
This is incredible.
The Packers won 35-10, and Max McGee became an instant legend. Unfortunately, this is where it gets a little controversial. Because, in my opinion, Max McGee definitely should have been Super Bowl MVP over the quarterback, Bart Starr. Bart Starr only threw 250 yards.
Meh.
So 55% of those yards were to Max McGee. He threw 2 touchdowns, both of them to Max McGee. And he threw an interception, which is not very good. As well, no other player on the field had over 80 total yards. So if you were to add rushing and receiving, no one even touched 80.
Wow. This
And
is crazy.
he had 138 receiving yards.
This is like the biggest Super Bowl MVP snub of all time.
Max McGee's story? Fucking legendary.
For sure.
Turning a hungover night into glory. Underdog into hero. Max McGee is by far one of my favorite stories.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
That reminds me of, Wilt Chamberlain in his prime.
Yeah, or Michael Jordan or Dennis Rodman, one of those legends who just would disappear, show up at 3 o'clock in the morning back at their hotel room, sleep for 2 hours, and then go out and put together one of the all-time great performances.
Absolutely. Thank you for listening to this week's episode.
You can find us on Twitter/X at FBConspiracies, where we will post all the graphics we spoke about during this episode.
You can also reach us by email using fbconspiracies@gmail.com.
A special thanks to Blaze for the intro and outro music.
If you enjoyed, consider leaving a review.
Join us next week for more football conspiracies.
And you know what? This does bring to mind a personal story that I know we haven't told many of on the podcast yet, but we hope to share a few more. This is one where I was told this by my high school teacher, who told me that one night his father was out partying in, I'm not exactly sure, an American city. And the next day, he was going to go see Wilt Chamberlain play in the NBA game. That night, before the game, he went out to a club. And when he walked in, none other than Wilt Chamberlain was there.
Oh my god.
Apparently, he was holding, like, a bottle in his hand, had women all surrounding him, and he walked out of the club at 4:30 a.m. with a girl under either arm and a bottle in each hand, and walked into his limo. The next day, at noon, he shot a double-double.
Wow, for Wilt Chamberlain, that's shit.
It's an awful game for Wilt. Give him a break.
This could turn into a Wilt Chamberlain story podcast, because my favorite Wilt Chamberlain story is when he was in an elevator with Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, and a fan walked in and looked at them and goes, "How's the weather up there?" And Wilt Chamberlain spat on the dude and said, "It's raining."
That is so mean. Oh my god. Yeah, honestly, I could go on about this man for hours.
Yeah, but we are a football podcast, not a Kareem Abdul-Jabbar funny story podcast.
Exactly.